Legendary Pokemon are some of the most powerful Pokemon in the game. Despite having the blessings of the developer, not every legendary is good. In fact, some are downright terrible. In this video, we will find out which legendary is the worst competitively in every generation, and we will be comparing their competitive performances with the other legendaries in the generation they were released in. We will not be counting the few pre-evolved forms of certain legendaries, since they were clearly not designed to have the power that we typically associate with legendaries. And we're jumping right in, as the first generation gets us off to a fiery start with Gen 1 Moltres. Based on general knowledge of the competitive scene, you'd be forgiven for thinking Articuno is the worst of Pokemon's first 5 legendaries, but that distinction goes to Moltres. It does come down to those two though, and it's not necessarily due to their own faults, so much as some of the most stringent competition possible. Nothing touches Mewtwo obviously, and the original Uber was soon joined by Mew. Meanwhile, OU's resident legendary is the third of the bird trio, Zapdos, and with its excellent speed, meaning a high critical hit rate, alongside a devastating dual stab combination, meant in the absence of Rhydon on the opposing team, it was Tauros level threatening. Articuno was more of an offbeat choice, but it was also terrifying. Its Stab Blizzard, with its then 90% accuracy, was actually the strongest special attack in the game, even beating out Mewtwo's Psychic. Remember, in Gen 1, there was just one special stat, so Articuno didn't have the paltry special attack stat that it would pack from Gen 2 onwards, instead packing the same combined special attack and special defense that Zapdos and Moltres did. But of course, that meant Moltres' 85% accuracy Fire Blast would hit just as hard as Articuno's Blizzard, and in Gen 1, the move also had a nasty 30% burn rate. So what's the gulf between the two? Articuno is clearly better in non-OU tiers, getting itself spectacularly banned from UU while being legitimately threatening even in Ubers, while Moltres resided in NU, though it was quite good there. In OU though, they were fairly neck and neck. As it stands though, Articuno is just a tad better. The ability to threaten a one-hit KO on Rhydon is incredible, and it matches up better against opposing Zapdos. And of course, its ability to go for freezes falls in line with the strategies of many top Gen 1 teams. Moltres is still ferocious, with its Fire Blast burns combining with the partial trapping of Fire Spin to chip would-be answers like Chansey and Starmie into KO range of its much more powerful Hyper Beam. However, in addition to the worst Rhydon and Zapdos matchups, Fire Spam is not for every team when so much of Gen 1 hinges on going for freezes, whose permanent effect can only be undone by getting hit by fire, or haze, but nobody's using that. Plus, in Gen 1, Moltres is actually weak to ice since fire doesn't resist it yet, a weakness Articuno lacks. It's still a legitimately great Pokemon, but something's gotta be the worst of the superb bunch in Gen 1, and that just winds up being Moltres. Next up, even in the second generation, it would also be a fire type, as Entei is the worst legendary of Generation 2. But before we get to the next Pokemon, I sure love playing old formats with better legendaries than the Pokemon on this list. Oh, this nice phone I'm playing it on? This is today's sponsor, the REDMAGIC 10 Air. REDMAGIC is the gold standard when it comes to smartphones, and REDMAGIC was kind enough to send us the thinner version of their amazing REDMAGIC 10 Pro. Equipped with a Snapdragon 8 Gen 3 chipset and a 120Hz refresh rate screen, mobile games have never looked better for me. The animations in Pocket TCG when I open packs every day have never looked smoother, as well as other games such as Monster Hunter Now. Equipped with the Android OS and REDMAGIC's own amazing features, I can play emulators quite smoothly. I enjoy wiping in Emerald Kaizo, and even Melee, which feels pretty good on this phone thanks to lower input delay. But if these games are too old for your taste, it runs a lot of mainstream games like Genshin Impact very well. And of course, you know I just love to hop on to Ranbats when I'm bored. The REDMAGIC 10 Air also features liquid metal cooling technology in addition to its cooling fan and vapor chamber to better evenly distribute heat when it gets hot. This combined with a 6000 mAh battery, which is the largest battery of its class for mid-range phones, the REDMAGIC 10 Air can run for 28 hours on a single charge and only takes 52 minutes to charge the whole thing. So if you want an amazing, affordable gaming smartphone and also support the channel to help us produce more content, click my link in the description below. On one hand, Entei is quite similar to Moltres. It is up against some seriously elite competition. Lugia is the Uber's Wall, taking on even King Snorlax, and threatening to sweep with curse-boosted Aeroblast late game. Ho-Oh and Celebi, for all their flaws that have some players suggesting that they be tested in OU, are still excellent Pokemon that would tower over standard play. In OU itself, Entei's fellow legendary beasts are top tier, especially Raikou, simultaneously the go-to special wall and a major offensive threat, while Suicune is basically OU's Lugia in its pure walling ability that makes it a stall staple. On the other hand, Entei is dissimilar to Moltres, and that is just not very good in its own right. Sure, it's BL, because it'd be way too much for UU, but it just doesn't have a serious place in in OU. It has a niche, but that's because players wanted to find a way to use their beloved Entei, not because it was the best choice for a particular role. Entei suffers from the common early gen problem where it has a high attack stat and a special stab type in a time before Diamond and Pearl's physical special split, known colloquially as Gyarados syndrome, and its physical move pool is paltry. The best it can do in Gen 2 is Sunny Day. It does have several things going for it though. Number 1, unlike fellow Sunny Day user Moltres, Entei isn't weak to the thunders of Gen 2's resident legendary Electric, Zapdos, and Raikou. So even if they connect in spite of their 50% accuracy under Sun, it's not nearly as threatened. Number 2, also unlike Moltres, Entei has access to Solar Beam, which is incredible, allowing it to threaten major targets in Starmie, Suicune, Vaporeon, and Golem. Number 3, Entei's excellent attack stat lets it wield Hidden Power Fighting to immediately threaten a highly likely 2-hit KO on Tyranitar, as well as decent damage without the need of a Sunny Day setup against Snorlax. Here's the bad news. Entei is completely and utterly outclassed by Moltres as a Sunny Day user, because it has only 90 base special attack, as opposed to Moltres' stunning 125. With Charcoal attached, Moltres can threaten to 2-hit KO Snorlax and Sun, and always maintains a 3-hit KO. Entei doesn't come close in this regard. Moltres' Fire Blast is so powerful, it doesn't even need coverage. It just goes with Sunny Day, Fire Blast, Rest, and Sleep Talk, and still outdoes Entei by a mile. It's assisted further by its incredible immunities to Spikes and Earthquake. Moltres is a real deal OU threat, and Entei is a gimmick. And even if it weren't outclassed by Moltres though, Entei wouldn't have a serious OU niche and would pale in comparison to the other Gen 2 legend contemporaries. But at least in the 3rd generation, Fires would no longer be the worst, as Regirock is the worst Gen 3 legendary. Alright, Gen 3 didn't introduce any fire legendaries, which was particularly strange in a gen where a box art legend summons Permanent Sun, and it was also a place where many legendaries were introduced as the first 2 generations combined. Anyway, Regirock is quite a good Pokemon, but it's just not competing with the other overpowered legendaries like Latias, Latios, Groudon, Kyogre, Rayquaza, and Deoxys, nor is it going to match OU's Jirachi. Therefore, its competition is, well, its fellow Regis, which reside in BL right with it. Though for a long time, Regice was OU. It eventually dropped due to the increasing specificity of its role as a special hit taker and enabler of calm minesweepers on offense teams, but specifically because those types of teams are quite good and because its utility is the most broad on both offense and defense, it narrowly remains the best of the 3. Though it's close, its special hit taking Thunder Wave, Blissey baiting Explosion, and of course Stab Ice Beam make it the most generally useful. So then it comes down to Registeel versus Regirock, and there, Steel just barely edges the Rock out. And though it seems too weak with low attack and lack of useful stabs, it has established itself as genuinely good thanks to its immense bulk alongside the excellence of pure steel typing. Though Regirock's got the massive defense stat, Registeel's Rock Slide resist is incredible, and it also packs an invaluable Meteor Mash resist, as opposed to Rock's weakness. Furthermore, its water neutrality makes it incredibly difficult to take out even for offensive threats like Starmie and Suicune. Registeel winds up playing as a cross between defensive Jirachi and Metagross. It lacks recovery, but it's insanely bulky, and in spite of its low attack, it can go on the offensive quite effectively once it's exhausted its walling capacity thanks to the power of early gen Explosion. Make no mistake though, Regirock is just about as legitimate as Registeel, having been used to success in serious tournament play. Somewhat similar to Registeel, it basically functions as a second Metagross, except it does so much more aggressively. One of the problems with Metagross is that it's insanely threatening, but often needs to explode to deliver on its threat potential. And after that, you don't have a Metagross anymore. That's where Regirock comes in, offering solid attack alongside Stab Rock Slide and boosting with Curse, making it a sort of meta by way of Snorlax that you can either use to bolster your offense after meta booms early, or you can open the gates for meta with your Rock early on. It can also utilize some other neat tools like Choice Band Superpower. The problem? Regirock really only works on offense. Registeel is more flexible, either acting as a bulky pivot on offense or slotting into pure stall, thus leaving Regirock as the worst. But that wouldn't even be the end for the Regis, as of course Regigigas is the worst legendary in Generation 4. Well, this one comes as no surprise. Famously a recipient of our How Bad Was This Pokemon Actually videos, which is made all the more stupefying by its status as not just a legendary, but as the leader of the Golems and with some truly insane stats, only to be chained by one of the worst abilities ever for some bizarrely inscrutable reason, as if Game Freak seemingly possessed by the spirit of Marquise de Sade went out of their way to make such a threatening Pokemon only so they could say, actually lol, no, every turn is crucial in competitive play. It's why free turn enablers like sleep, freeze, full paralysis, and flinch are so controversial. Regigigas gives away 5 free turns every time it switches in. Maybe if it were like a sort of reverse Ash Greninja situation where you had to wait for it to unleash its final form, but once you did, you were good to go, it would be okay. But as it stands, Regigigas could forget about competing with Dialga and Palkia, and instead wound up slamming it in an NU, where it was also almost worthless. And with that, the Regis were thus the worst legendary in back-to-back generations. Though this time around, the distinction was far more dubious, and not to be repeated in Gen 5, as Virizion is the worst Gen 5 legendary for singles, but Cobalion is the worst for VGC. Virizion actually started Gen 5 off quite well. It had Breloom's typing and Infernape's speed tier, as well as Infernape's ability to attack both physically and specially. It had quite a unique place in Gen 5's Weather Wars, as it was highly effective against both sand and rain, both offensively and defensively, handling Excadrill, Landorus, and various water moves while helping against Thundurus and not fearing everyone's favorite, Ferrothorn. It especially gained renown during the dominance of Rainstall, as its Swords Dance set was the single biggest threat to those teams, since it didn't fear their catch-all unaware Quagsire whatsoever. Get up Stealth Rock to break Dragonite's multiscale, and you're off to the races. However, come Black and White 2, Virizion stumbled. It had major competition in Technician Breloom and the newly added Sword of Justice Keldeo, both much more powerful. Virizion's base 90 offenses could be quite underwhelming, now more than ever, especially defensive Celebi was absolutely everywhere and was joined by Amoonguss, meaning its wall-breaking capabilities no longer got it anywhere. The emergence of Psychic Spam just made it even more impossible to use. Virizion thus dropped to UU, where it met its competitor for Gen 5's worst legendary, fellow Sword of Justice Cobalion, who was previously viewed as Diet Lucario, would have been a lock for the title, but now things were more contentious. Virizion was a solid threat in UU, but there was plenty of fighting competition that easily outdid both it and Cobalion damage-wise, so the decider was the utility the two of them would bring, since they weren't going to be matching Mean Shao or Heracross in raw damage output, and in this regard, Cobalion was far better. That steel typing alongside its great defense meant it was excellent at taking on metagame Juggernaut Snorlax, and it wasn't just an offensive threat. With Stealth Rock and Volt Switch, it was a hazard-setting momentum machine. The quad resist to Heracross's Mega Horn was superb for staving off the Choice Scarf for late game too. Virizion, on the other hand, wasn't nearly as useful defensively, and it didn't have any sort of utility and really suffered from needing a boost to threaten much of the tier, and even with the boost, it struggled with Crobat everywhere. On the bright side, Cobalion was the worst of the bunch of VGC, as its typing and utility weren't especially notable, seeing the worst amount of notable usage of the trio, whereas Terrakion saw a great amount of usage thanks to its sheer power, speed, and amazing dual stabs, especially in VGC 2011, a format run by the Flying-type Genies. Those Genies wanted no business with another high-attack Rock Slide user that was faster than Tyranitar. And as for Virizion, even Virizion was excellent for taking on Sand and Rain, just as it had early in singles. So at least Virizion avoided that double whammy of being bad in both formats. But our next legendary wasn't so fortunate, as Zygarde is the worst legendary of Generation 6. Gen 7 Zygarde was absurdly broken, not just with its over-the-top complete variant, but even in its original form thanks to Thousand Arrows, which was basically Earthquake if you couldn't take it on with flying or levitate Pokemon. Yeah, no big deal, they've only been the best of the limited answers to the eternal excellence of Stab Earthquake forever. Had Pokemon Z been released, Zygarde would have gotten itself canned from Gen 6 as well, and we'd never dream of putting it on this list. But as it stands, Zygarde didn't obtain the perfect form until the following generation, so it spent all of X and Y and Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire as a third-rate Garchomp with a fourth-rate move pool. You'd be better off with Mega Garchomp, or just forget the Dragon Ground thing and just use Landorus, Therian, or Gliscor. Yes, Zygarde gets Dragon Dance, and yes, technically, that means it can do something, but it tends to follow in the unimpressive footsteps of Gen 2 Entei. Just because it has a niche for the occasion that it would get used, doesn't mean it should actually get used. This is especially rough because Zygarde, while not technically the first box art legendary on this list, given the fact that it never actually received the game that it would be on the box art of, is still part of Gen 6's defining legendary trio, so it is the first box art adjacent legendary to be included on account of Game Freak's generation-long style of giving it Giratina and Kyurem style upgrades. And though Zygarde is indeed the choice of Gen 6's worst, it's not without competition. It does have competition in the form of Hoopa Confined, which is all the way down in RU, whereas Zygarde is BL, after having thoroughly destroyed UU. However, we're going by OU viability, and amazingly, Hoopa manages to eke Zygarde out there, in spite of how physically frail and comparatively slow it is. It's no star, but it does have a legitimate niche on certain hazard-abusing hyper-offense teams, especially Sticky Web, because it blocks Rapid Spin, allowing counterplay against Oraz's ever-present utility, Excadrill. This is niche, but it is viable, and certainly to a greater extent, impact and all, than Zygarde's potential role of Dragon Dancing on dual screens offense, which is so niche as to almost not even exist. Oh, and it gets worse, as Zygarde is also the worst in VGC, because there, it is also a poor trainer's Garchomp, as it is much slower and much weaker. A poor trainer's Garchomp will also never be chosen over the meta-defining Geomancy Xerneas. Even Evoltal has a solid amount of placements in VGC 2016. Zygarde is a Z-grade legendary and our first double whammy as the worst in both singles and doubles. But it wouldn't be long before it was joined by the second, as Necrozma is our worst legendary in Gen 7. Now, it wouldn't take Necrozma until the next generation for it to receive two forms, Kyurem style, with the possibility to then burst into another Zygarde style super form on top of that. But its base form is thoroughly unimpressive compared to the cavalcade of Cosmic Crushers crawling around Gen 7. Like Gen 6 Zygarde, base Necrozma isn't even close to being on par with its fellow box art trio members. Underwhelming though Solgaleo is, it is still uber, while Necrozma, for all its many great traits, a superb move pool, good power and bulk, the latter enhanced by Prism Armor's weakening of super effective attacks, not only fails to match its fellow Gen 7 legendaries, it doesn't even come close. In addition to Lunala and Solgaleo residing in Ubers, all four Tapus define OU. Necrozma, on the other hand, languishes all the way down in RU. It's very good, more than you'd expect when you hear the words RU Psychic type, but its unimpressive speed, alongside pure Psychic typing, hurts when you consider that its good traits are good, but hardly incredible, as you would expect from a Pokemon of its stature. Again, it's not quite a box art legendary in the most technical sense, because its base form isn't actually on the box art, but it is the second consecutive box art adjacent Pokemon to be the worst. Now, there is a Gen 7 legendary Pokemon that, strictly speaking, is worse than Necrozma. Silvally, the mini Arceus. It's an untiered Pokemon, not even good enough for PU, and is clearly nowhere near Necrozma's level. However, in a way, that is precisely why we don't feel like it fits this list. Here's why. When considering the worst legendary, there is an unspoken implication that drives the very intrigue of the idea. Legendary Pokemon are given more tools to succeed than your average Pokemon. They are more powerful. Thus, the intrigue comes from seeing a Pokemon with legendary stats who still fail to live up to the promise of its powerful counterparts. So Volley is not more powerful than your average Pokemon. In fact, it's a good deal weaker. Yes, it can run any type in the game, and it's quite balanced, with base 95 across the board, resembling the base 100 Pixies, which have been competitive staples since Pokemon's inception. However, as power creep has taken its toll, even base 100 across the board is no longer impressive. In fact, it's often rather underwhelming. Base 95? Forget it. Now consider every other Pokemon on this list thus far. Moltres, Entei, Regirock, Regigigas, Virizion, Zygarde, each of them have at least base 102 stats, and are generally going quite a bit beyond that benchmark. 4 of those 6 have at least base 103 stats, 5 if you count General Moltres and its special stat as both special attack and special defense. Does Silvally, unable to break 95 in a single stat, really deserve to be ranked against these? We don't think so. If you prefer, then yes, Silvally is clearly Gen 7's worst fully evolved legendary, but we prefer to highlight Necrozma as Gen 7's worst fully realized legendary, and it is also the worst in BGC. It's a restricted Pokemon, but nobody was going to be blowing a restricted slot on base Necrozma when they could use one of its boosted forms. Meanwhile, Silvally actually got some usage in 2017. Sure, it was a smaller Pokedex format, but it still counts. Thus, Necrozma really followed in Zygarde's footsteps with the whole box art adjacent double whammy deal. And Gen 8 wouldn't quite repeat this, but it sure came close, as Glastrier is our worst legendary of Gen 8 for singles, and Galarian Articuno is our worst for VGC. Glastrier is a truly bizarre case. It's not truly a box art legend, but it and Spectrier, along with the Calyrex that fuses with them, were the icons of the Crown Tundra DLC, making it somewhat adjacent to the concept. It and Spectrier certainly have stats similar to such Pokemon anyway. Glastrier has 4 stats above base 100. Well, its HP is 100 exactly, but base HP is calculated differently, and thus base 100 HP is much more impressive than, say, 100 attack. As for attack, Glastrier is coming in at a stunning base 145, coming in on the likes of Groudon and Zekrom, and is doing so with one of the most ferocious stabs in the game, Ice, which is complemented by the amazing coverage of high horsepower and close combat. Meanwhile, that impressive base 100 HP is complemented by a stunning base 130 defense and excellent base 110 special defense. This makes it bulkier than the Necrozma Duskmane. Okay, so it's extremely slow and Ice has many weaknesses, but with that power and with that stab and coverage alongside that bulk, and in the generation which introduced heavy duty boots so as to bypass Stealth Rock, letting it actually wield that bulk, surely it can do something, right? You know where Glastrier wound up? Untier. It's okay in NU, but barely viable in PU, reflected by its usage failing to keep it in either tier. Now, Glacier does technically have the slightest of slight OU niches, which theoretically would make it not the worst. That niche almost doesn't even exactly exist though, but it is there, and that's why we've decided it should split the title for Gen 8's worst legendary with Galarian Articuno, which is a behemoth in the PU that Glacier fails to compete in, but certainly can't even pretend towards an OU niche the way Glacier can. It goes to show the strangeness of the tiering system. You'd think we'd be used to it by now, having watched Quagsire and Gastrodon demonstrate it in so many times, but it's still jarring. Anyway, Galar Articuno is a low-tier terror, dominating not just PU but NU as well, packing a tremendous unique stab combination of Hurricane and Future Sight off of its base 125 special attack stat, recalling its Gen 1 incarnation, but with a new Gen twist on the catch-22 positions that it would lock opponents into with the delayed effect of Future Sight. It can't keep up with its legendary companions, but that's hardly shameful given the power creep it's facing and the fact that it's so genuinely good in its own right. As for the Glacier of it all, we feel it's fair to include it despite its OU viability because similar to our Gen 7 logic, it seems to have been given much more than Galarian Articuno, yet it's so much worse, so we feel it's fair. However, Galarian Articuno is the worst of the Gen 8 legends in VGC, with its typing and utility by far the most bland. Even though it had the useful Intimidate punishing competitive ability, it struggled against Incineroar, especially in relation to its fellow Galarian birds. Galarian Zapdos' Intimidate abusing Defiant was self-evident in its excellence alongside a superb stab combination, including a super effective smash against the Big Cat, while Galarian Moltres' own unique stabs went to terrifying extremes in conjunction with Berserk, Weakness Policy, and Dynamax. And it wasn't just the birds either. Galarian Articuno had less usage and utility than the specific and limited Regidrago. Boy, we're so glad the Regis didn't manage to hat trick for worst legendary. And yes, it's even worse than Glacier, whose flaws were still there but grabbed a few high placements, not unlike its technically existent OU viability. Also, in keeping with our logic on Silvally, we're not counting base Calyrex because yes, it's got 100 base HP, but then its other stats are all base 80. Nothing so similar to Glalie should be compared with legendaries that actually have legendary stats. And now we're off to the final boss of sorts, with our worst legendary of Gen 9 being Wo-Chien. In the most power-crept generation of all, one legendary Pokemon dared to be different, standing among its fellow treasures of ruin, a set of legendaries which produced the absurdly broken Chi-Yu and Xin-Pao, who were banned from the same OU tier that Ting-Lu would eventually become a defensive staple in. Wo-Chien stood out. It dared to be absolutely terrible. The gap between Wo-Chien and its fellow treasures of ruin is staggering. Forget Yu-Yu or something, Wo-Chien is all the way down in PU, and it's not just the ruinous quarter that it trails by some distance either, but all of its fellow legends. Even the less obviously broken or at least excellent ones like Terapagos and Enamorus. Even the loyal 3 by and large leave it in the dust too. Okidogi is too much for Yu-Yu and is worthwhile in OU, Pheasantipity is great in RU and can even work in OU, and Monkey Dory is excellent in NU and works in RU as well. Wo-Chien, though it can work in RU and NU, is firmly embedded in PU in spite of its outstanding base 135 special defense and strong base 100 defense, alongside a solid base 85 HP and an ability whose weakening of opposing attack stats significantly enhances its physical bulk. It's also got some of the most obnoxious moves in the game. Not only is it rocking the Leech Seed and knockoff combo, that knockoff is Stab, and their effect really takes its toll in a hurry, combined with the Treasure's signature move, Ruination. So what's the problem? Well, Wo-Chien is slow, not very strong, and its moves, while impactful, struggle to carry it at the kind of pace demanded nowadays, especially considering its Dark Grass typing leaves it riddled with all manner of readily exploitable weaknesses. Among others, it's most notably fearful of fighting, fairy, fire, ice, and a seriously nasty quadruple weakness to U-turn. It recalls several generations of Celebi, with its great walling potential betrayed by just how easy it is to hit super effectively. And it certainly isn't a bad Pokemon, but it pales in comparison to its fellow legendaries. And to really hammer this home, you have to consider the VGC of it all, where just about every legendary is cracked in some bonkers way, from the world's winning Miraidon to the Koraidon right behind it, such as on Wolf's successful Perish Trap team, to every form of Ogerpon running over everything in sight, to the other treasures of ruin, with Chi-Yu and Xin-Pao nuking all in sight with Dark Stab, while Ting-Lu is also all over the place spamming Fisher. Once again, Wo-Chien takes a unique stand in being terrible. Psych! Just kidding, it's not the worst. Oh, it comes close for sure, but in spite of the many jokes at its expense, Moxie Boosted and others have given it some solid VGC performances with it in tow. The loyal 3 though, minus Okidogi, because it's actually good, so really the remaining loyal 2, Pheasantipity and Monkey Dory, are so close to being the worst that it almost pains us to split hairs over the race to the sub-Wo-Chien bottom. Monkey Dory has slightly better performances, but they're really almost interchangeable as far as viability is concerned. Overall though, Pheasantipity is slower and less powerful, so you're less likely to muscle your way to some success with it. Either way, Wo-Chien is thankful to both of them for ensuring it doesn't get hit with the singles doubles double whammy. And thank you so much to our Platinum tier patrons. Thank you to Amphozenus, Alex Sable, Anthony Balbal Renault, Bingleton, Daniel S. Beast, Dr. Mint, Funky, Glitcherton, Hal, Jack G, King Yabber, Megamon VGC, Nurse Jake, Pretzel SP, Sojiro Sakura, Spavoon, Skylaria, Soras and Croxon, Shiwei Miji, Stoneface Colin, and Kaboflu for their major support of our videos.